how many civilizations came before us, and how many vanished so completely that even their shadows dissolved into the soil. There are centuries we call ancient, and then there are tens of thousands of years we quietly label prehistory, as if the absence of writing were the absence of meaning. Somewhere between the first trembling spark of symbolic thought and the first pressed mark of clay, something feels unfinished, as though an entire chapter has been torn from a book whose cover still survives. So before you let your body sink fully into this quiet comfort, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you truly feel connected to what is unfolding here, and share your location and local time in the comments. It is strangely comforting to know where in the world these questions are being whispered. For nearly 300,000 years, Homo sapiens has walked this planet. That number rests calmly in textbooks, measured through fossils found in Morocco and Ethiopia, dated with patient precision. 300 millennia of breath, of hunger, of fear beneath lightning-lit skies. And yet the earliest known writing appears only about 5,000 years ago in the clay tablets of southern Mesopotamia. Between those 2 points stretches a span of time so vast that the rise and fall of Rome would fit inside it hundreds of times. It is within that silence that the first unease begins. For most of human existence there are no chronicles, no kings carved in stone, no carefully enumerated dynasties. There are bones, hearths, fragments of ochre, scattered tools shaped from flint. There are cave paintings deep in places like Chauvet and Lascaux, astonishing in their sophistication, as though the human mind leapt suddenly into metaphor. But there is no continuous story, no timeline that feels secure. Modern archaeology speaks of gradual development, hunter-gatherers becoming sedentary, agriculture emerging independently in several regions after the last ice age, villages slowly turning into cities. It is a reasonable narrative, built from carbon dates and layers of sediment, and yet, even within this framework, there are fractures. The end of the last ice age, around 11,700 years ago, marked a profound shift. The Younger Dryas, a sudden return to near glacial conditions after a warming trend, disrupted ecosystems across the northern hemisphere. Megafauna vanished. Human groups were forced to adapt quickly. Some researchers have proposed that a comet impact or fragmented airburst may have triggered wildfires and abrupt cooling, though this remains debated. The geological record shows layers of unusual material in certain regions, microspherules, elevated platinum levels, clues that suggest something dramatic occurred. If such an event did unfold, how much could it have erased? Sea levels rose more than 100 meters as glaciers melted. Coastlines, where human populations often cluster, would have been swallowed. Entire settlements, if they existed along those ancient shores, now rest beneath continental shelves. The memory of them, if it survived at all, would have been carried only in story, passed from mouth to mouth until it thinned into myth. There is something unsettling about the idea that history begins only where writing begins. Writing is a technology of preservation, but it is also a filter. What of societies that never carved their memory into stone? What of cultures that encoded their knowledge in ritual, in songlines, in oral epics vulnerable to interruption? Anthropologists studying oral traditions have observed how stories can preserve astonishingly ancient memories. Some Aboriginal Australian narratives appear to describe coastlines that match geological maps from over 7,000 years ago, before sea levels stabilised. These accounts were not written. They were sung, repeated, lived. They survived without ink, and yet survival through memory is fragile. A single generation disrupted by famine, migration, or violence can fracture continuity. A language lost can take cosmologies with it. There is also the quiet pressure of interpretation. 19th century scholars often viewed pre-agricultural humans as primitive, incapable of complex organisation. That bias shaped early reconstructions of the past. Only gradually did evidence accumulate to challenge that simplicity. Burial sites with grave goods, long-distance trade in obsidian, elaborate ritual structures, each discovery nudged the timeline of sophistication backward. Still, a deeper question lingers. Does complexity always leave visible traces? Imagine a society that mastered sustainable living, leaving minimal permanent structures. Imagine knowledge stored not in monumental architecture, but in carefully managed ecosystems. If such a culture disappeared, would we recognize its remains as anything more than scattered campsites? The archaeological record is not a complete archive. It is a survival of accidents. Stone survives. Fired clay survives. Metal corrodes but sometimes endures. Wood decays. Fibre vanishes. Spoken words dissolve instantly into air. When we walk through museums and gaze at the earliest tablets from Uruk, impressed by their neat columns of grain tallies and temple offerings, we are seeing the beginning of recorded administration, not necessarily the beginning of organized thought. Civilization, as commonly defined, emerges with cities, specialization, hierarchy. But social complexity can exist without skyscrapers of mud brick. The idea that nothing significant happened before 4000 BCE is a convenient boundary. It keeps the narrative manageable. Yet even within accepted history there are surprises. Sites like Jericho reveal substantial settlements around 10,000 BCE. Çatalhöyük shows dense habitation and symbolic art millennia before the pyramids. These are not anomalies invented from imagination. They are excavated realities. Each pushes the threshold of civilized behavior further into the past. But the silence before them remains immense. Some researchers have suggested that climatic instability at the end of the Pleistocene may have forced repeated cycles of innovation and collapse. Small agricultural experiments might have arisen and failed before stabilizing in the Holocene's more predictable warmth. If that were true, then the story of civilization would not be a single ascent, but a series of attempts, some remembered, others forgotten. It is difficult to prove absence. Archaeology depends on what can be unearthed, and what can be unearthed depends on preservation. Tropical climates, with their heat and humidity, erase organic evidence quickly. Rising seas conceal coastal plains. Tectonic shifts bury layers deep beneath younger sediment. In this context, the prehistory of humanity feels less like emptiness and more like a dimly lit hall whose walls we have barely traced with our hands. There is another subtle fracture in the timeline, the emergence of symbolic cognition. By at least 70,000 years ago, humans were creating personal ornaments, using pigments, engraving abstract patterns. Such behavior implies not only intelligence but shared meaning. Meaning requires communication, trust, collective memory. Could societies capable of symbolism and long-distance trade truly have remained perpetually simple for tens of thousands of years? Or did they experiment with forms of organization that left too little behind to satisfy our criteria? The term civilization itself may conceal assumptions. It suggests permanence, architecture, visible dominance over landscape. But what if earlier cultures valued mobility, balance, or secrecy? What if their greatness was not measured in monuments but in continuity with environment? There is no need to invoke fantasy to feel the unease. The known record is already incomplete by nature. The Earth is an active system. It subducts crust, grinds mountains to dust, reshapes river valleys. Given enough time, even steel and concrete would decay beyond recognition. If our own cities were abandoned, how long before forests reclaimed them? A few centuries would obscure them. A few millennia would fragment them. A few 100,000 years might erase them almost entirely. And that span is barely longer than our species has existed. The silence before writing may not signify emptiness. It may signify vulnerability. Perhaps there were no advanced global empires before Sumer. Perhaps there were only scattered bands slowly weaving the fabric of culture. Yet even that weaving could have formed patterns more intricate than we imagine. Patterns lost not because they were insignificant, but because the medium that held them was too delicate. The first clay tablets mark the moment when memory hardened into artifact. Before that, memory was breath. Breath is easily interrupted. And so the question lingers gently in the dark. If we rely on writing to define the beginning of history, what do we call the countless generations who lived, loved, built, and perhaps even organized themselves in ways we can no longer detect? Are they merely prelude, or are they a chapter whose pages dissolved long before we learned to read? The silence stretches backward still, patient and unbothered by our need for certainty. And somewhere within that depth of time, there may be more than emptiness. There may be the faint outline of something that once stood, waited, and disappeared before anyone thought to press a mark into clay. The silence before the first written record does not feel empty. It feels crowded with absence. 300,000 years of human existence, and only the last fraction of that span speaks to us in ink. The rest is sediment and shadow. Fossils from Jebel Irhoud in Morocco suggest our species was already anatomically modern long before cities, long before kings, long before grain was tallied in temple courtyards. Yet the story most often told begins in Sumer, as though humanity awakened fully formed beside the Euphrates. That gap is not small. It is not a minor preface. It is the overwhelming majority of our time on Earth. For tens of thousands of years, humans navigated landscapes that no longer exist in their ancient form. Vast plains now lie beneath the North Sea. The area once known as Doggerland connected Britain to continental Europe, a broad and fertile expanse gradually consumed by rising waters at the end of the last ice age. Archaeologists dredging fishing nets have recovered bones, tools, fragments of antler harpoons from that drowned world. It was not empty. It held communities, perhaps generations deep in tradition. When sea levels rose more than 100 meters globally between roughly 20,000 and 7,000 years ago, coastlines shifted inward dramatically. If early settlements clustered near rivers and shores, as they often do, then entire chapters of human habitation now lie submerged, under layers of silt, beneath cold currents, beneath continental shelves that we rarely explore with precision. Marine archaeology has begun to reveal traces, stone structures off the coast of India near Dwarka, debated formations near Yonaguni in Japan, submerged remnants in the Mediterranean. But the ocean is vast and expensive to search. The silence beneath it is thick. Geology itself conspires against preservation. Earthquakes fracture cities. Volcanic eruptions bury landscapes in ash. The super-eruption of Toba around 74,000 years ago may have reduced human populations dramatically, though the scale of its impact remains debated. Genetic studies suggest bottlenecks in our species' past, moments when humanity may have been reduced to relatively small breeding populations. If culture is carried by people, and people nearly vanish, what becomes of their accumulated knowledge? One might imagine that if a complex civilization had existed, it would have left unmistakable signs: steel alloys, synthetic compounds, isotopic anomalies. Yet complexity is not a single scale. A society can be advanced in organization, symbolism, and environmental understanding without industrial residue. If it built primarily with perishable materials, if it maintained a modest population density, if it avoided massive stone monuments, then its trace might be faint indeed after 10 or 20 millennia. The archaeological record favours stone and fire. Pottery shards endure. Charcoal layers persist. But woven textiles, wooden architecture, and oral law leave almost nothing. Tropical climates accelerate decay so efficiently that entire settlements may dissolve within centuries. Even in temperate regions, ploughing and erosion scatter evidence beyond easy recognition. What complicates the narrative further is the growing acknowledgement that human cognition has been sophisticated for a very long time. The cave paintings of Chauvet, dated to over 30,000 years ago, display shading, motion, and symbolic abstraction. They are not clumsy beginnings, they are accomplished works, suggesting artists already fluent in visual language. Personal ornaments carved from shell and bone appear even earlier. These are signs of shared identity, of networks, of meaning. If symbolic thought and long-distance trade existed tens of thousands of years before agriculture, then social coordination must have been advanced as well. Coordination implies structure. Structure implies memory. The conventional model proposes that agriculture, emerging independently in regions like the Fertile Crescent around 10,000 BCE, triggered the rise of permanent settlements, and eventually cities. This framework is grounded in substantial evidence, yet even here anomalies arise. Göbekli Tepe, with its massive T-shaped pillars arranged in circular enclosures and dated to around 9,600 BCE, predates established agriculture in the region. Its builders were likely hunter-gatherers, yet they organised labour at a scale once thought impossible for non-farming societies. The site was deliberately buried after centuries of use, intentionally concealed. Why bury a monumental structure? Some scholars interpret it as ritual closure, a common cultural act. Others see in it a deeper transition, perhaps marking a shift in worldview at the end of the Ice Age. Whatever the reason, Göbekli Tepe complicates the linear progression from simple to complex. It suggests that social and symbolic sophistication did not wait patiently for ploughed fields. This is not evidence of a lost global empire hidden in fantasy. It is evidence that our timeline may be more layered than we assumed. The term prehistory implies that nothing worthy of narrative occurred. Yet oral traditions from various cultures preserve memories of floods, of lands swallowed by water, of ancestral homes abandoned. Aboriginal Australian stories align strikingly with geological reconstructions of ancient coastlines. Indigenous North American traditions recount volcanic eruptions consistent with known events. Memory can stretch further than expected when carefully maintained, but memory also transforms. It mythologizes. It encodes trauma in symbol. If there were societies that flourished and then vanished in climatic upheaval, their stories might persist only as metaphors of God's anger or cosmic punishment. There is also the quiet influence of intellectual frameworks. Early archaeologists, shaped by colonial assumptions, often underestimated the capabilities of non-literate societies. Over time, as methods refined and biases were challenged, older conclusions were revised. Complexity was discovered where simplicity had been assumed. Each revision nudged the horizon backward. Still, there remains an enormous stretch of deep time, about which we know almost nothing in detail. Between the earliest known symbolic artifacts and the first cities lies tens of thousands of years of adaptation, migration, and cultural experimentation. It is statistically improbable that nothing unexpected occurred in that duration. And yet, the absence of durable evidence leaves room only for cautious speculation. Speculation, when untethered, drifts easily into invention. But careful questioning is different. It asks not for fantasies, but for humility. It recognizes that erosions, subduction, and decay are powerful editors. The Earth rewrites its surface continuously. If our present civilization were to collapse and be abandoned, how much would survive after 20,000 years? Glass might crumble into unrecognizable grains. Steel would oxidize and fragment. Concrete would fracture and be consumed by roots. Only certain alloys, perhaps certain buried repositories, might endure in fragments. Would distant descendants, or another species entirely, reconstruct our digital age from such remnants? Or would they interpret our traces as scattered curiosities, stripped of context? 300,000 years is a long rehearsal for 5,000 years of writing. The silence before clay tablets does not demand a hidden empire. It simply invites caution in declaring certainty. Perhaps there were no vast civilizations before Sumer. Perhaps there were only countless communities adapting to a volatile planet, rising briefly in cohesion before dispersing again. But even that pattern suggests cycles, attempts, renewals. History, then, would not be a single ascent from darkness, but a mosaic of beginnings. The first record we possess may not mark the first civilization. It may only mark the first one that left a durable mark in the materials we happen to recognize. And as the layers of sediment continue to shift beneath deserts and oceans, as new technologies scan the seabed and probe buried landscapes, one cannot help but feel that the silence of prehistory is less a void than a waiting field, waiting for careful hands, waiting for fragments to surface. If so much of our own present would fade in deep time, what confidence can we hold about the completeness of the past? The question does not accuse. It lingers quietly, like a footprint at the edge of a receding tide. And somewhere in that receding line between memory and oblivion, the possibility remains that what we call the beginning was only the latest emergence from a far older and far more fragile human story. The idea of a beginning is comforting. It suggests a clean horizon, a first dawn, a moment when complexity finally assembled itself and stepped into the light. In textbooks, that dawn is usually placed beside the rivers of Mesopotamia, where cuneiform signs pressed into clay announce the management of grain and livestock. Order, hierarchy, record. Civilization begins. But beneath that neat threshold lies an unease that does not fully dissolve. The Holocene, the relatively stable climatic epoch that began around 11,700 years ago, provided the environmental consistency necessary for large-scale agriculture. Before it, the Pleistocene was marked by glacial cycles, abrupt shifts, advancing and retreating ice sheets. Human groups endured these oscillations with mobility and adaptability. They tracked herds, followed seasons, and survived in landscapes that were anything but predictable. It is tempting to assume that such instability prevented sustained complexity. Yet instability can also sharpen ingenuity. The archaeological evidence shows that even during the late Ice Age, humans engaged in long-distance exchange networks. Obsidian from one volcanic source appears hundreds of kilometers away. Shell ornaments travel inland from distant coasts. This implies communication routes, trust relationships, possibly ritual alliances linking scattered groups. Coordination across such distances suggests more than simple survival. When one examines the distribution of early symbolic sites across Eurasia and Africa, a subtle pattern emerges. Human cognition, language, and abstract thought had already matured tens of thousands of years before the first cities. Genetic studies indicate that by roughly 60,000 to 70,000 years ago, populations were dispersing widely out of Africa, carrying with them complex linguistic capacities. Language itself, though intangible, is one of the most powerful technologies ever developed. It allows collective planning, myth-making, instruction. What if forms of social organisation flourished repeatedly, only to dissolve under environmental pressure? The Younger Dryas, beginning around 12,800 years ago, represents one such pressure point. Pollen records and ice cores from Greenland reveal a rapid drop in temperatures after a period of warming. Within decades, climates shifted dramatically in some regions. Large mammals, already under strain, disappeared. Human communities would have faced crop failures, migration challenges, social tension. Some researchers have proposed that a fragmented comet impact contributed to this sudden cooling. Evidence such as elevated platinum levels in sediment layers has been cited in support of this hypothesis, though it remains controversial and debated within the scientific community. Regardless of the exact cause, the climatic shock is well documented. When environments transform quickly, fragile systems collapse first. If small-scale agricultural experiments had begun prior to the Younger Dryas, they may have faltered. Sites like Abu Huraira in Syria suggest that communities were harvesting wild grains even before full domestication took hold. The line between forager and farmer may not have been a single leap, but a gradual negotiation with changing conditions. It is possible that early attempts at settled life flickered on and off, leaving only faint archaeological signatures. A community might build modest dwellings of wood and earth, organise communal rituals, cultivate small plots, and then be forced to abandon the settlement when water sources failed or temperatures dropped. After centuries of abandonment, erosion would scatter what remained. Such cycles would not be easily distinguishable from seasonal camps in the distant future. The assumption that complexity steadily increases over time rests partly on what has survived. Monumental stone architecture endures. Mud brick cities, if preserved in arid climates, can be excavated. But what of societies that preferred perishable materials? What of coastal cultures whose primary constructions were timber, reeds, woven fibre? Marine surveys have identified submerged landscapes along continental margins, but systematic exploration remains limited. Under the Black Sea, for example, sonar imaging has revealed ancient shorelines now far below current water levels. In Southeast Asia, vast tracts of Sundaland were once exposed during lower sea levels, potentially supporting substantial populations. As waters rose, these plains vanished. If cultural centres existed there, their remnants now lie beneath sediment, inaccessible and largely invisible. There is also the quiet matter of interpretation. Archaeological paradigms evolve. Discoveries once dismissed as anomalies sometimes later become integrated into mainstream understanding. The timeline of human occupation in the Americas, for instance, has been extended backward as new evidence emerges, challenging earlier assumptions of a strictly recent arrival. Each revision reminds us that absence of proof is not proof of absence, especially in deep time contexts. Still, caution remains necessary. The temptation to fill silence with grandeur can lead to narratives unsupported by evidence. What can be said with integrity is that the archaeological record is incomplete by definition. It is a sampling of what happened to survive. Civilization is often equated with urbanism and written law, yet anthropologists recognize complex social structures among non-literate societies. Hierarchies, ceremonial centers, and trade networks can exist without script. The Mississippian culture in North America built earthen mounds and organized large settlements long before European contact, yet much of their narrative relies on archaeological reconstruction rather than written chronicle. If such societies existed closer to our time and still left gaps in understanding, how much more elusive would earlier ones be? The deeper one peers into human antiquity, the more one senses that the story may be less a straight ascent and more a series of plateaus. Innovation arises, stabilizes briefly, and sometimes recedes. Climatic shifts, volcanic eruptions, pandemics, and internal conflict all shape trajectories. Genetic bottlenecks indicate moments when humanity's numbers were dangerously low. A population reduced to a few thousand individuals would struggle to maintain elaborate systems of knowledge. Skills requiring specialized training might disappear in a generation. Oral epics might fragment. The subtle architecture of memory can unravel swiftly when social networks thin. Perhaps what we call the dawn of civilization was not the first light, but the first that endured long enough to cast a lasting shadow. When clay tablets from Uruk record transactions, they reflect a society already structured around temples and bureaucratic administration. Such systems do not materialize overnight. They emerge from preceding practices of accounting, of storage, of social agreement. Those preceding practices may have roots stretching deeper than the tablets themselves reveal. The silence before writing is not necessarily the silence before order, and so the question lingers, patient and unresolved. If human cognition has been complex for tens of thousands of years, if environmental upheavals have repeatedly reshaped the planet, if coastlines and river valleys that once hosted communities now lie altered or submerged, how confidently can we assert that no prior civilizations ever rose and faded before the ones we remember? The answer may not require lost continents or hidden empires. It may reside in smaller, quieter experiments in living together, societies that flourished briefly in stable niches and then dissolved when the climate turned, leaving only scattered tools and faint hearthstains. History begins where writing survives. But humanity began long before that. Between those two beginnings stretches a vast and largely unlit corridor, and somewhere in that corridor, beneath layers of sediment and forgetting, the possibility remains that what we call the first civilization was not the first attempt, only the first one we have learned to read. If the first civilizations we recognize emerged only after the climate steadied, then the long instability before that must have shaped human memory in ways we barely grasp. Ice advanced and retreated. Deserts expanded and softened. Rivers shifted course. In such a world, permanence would have been an illusion. To build for eternity would have seemed naive when the horizon itself could change within a lifetime. And yet, humans have always built for more than survival. Even in Paleolithic contexts, burials appear with care and symbolism. At sites like Sungir in Russia, individuals were interred with thousands of ivory beads, arranged deliberately as though the community wished to honour them beyond mere disposal of the body. This is not the behaviour of a species wandering without structure. It suggests social stratification, ritual, shared cosmology. It suggests continuity. Continuity requires transmission. The deeper question is not whether humans were intelligent in deep time, that is well established, but how their intelligence was organised. Did they form alliances that spanned generations? Did certain regions develop proto-urban nodes that waxed and waned before stabilising in the Holocene? Or was complexity always diffused, never condensing long enough to resemble what we later defined as civilization? The archaeological record gives hints but no complete answers. In parts of Anatolia and the Levant, sites from the Epipaleolithic period show semi-sedentary communities that harvested wild grains and constructed communal buildings. The Natufian culture, dating back over 12,000 years, demonstrates architectural investment before full domestication of crops. Stone foundations, grinding stones, evidence of social ritual. These indicate an organised life that blurs the boundary between forager and farmer. But the Natufian settlements did not persist unchanged. Climatic stress during the Younger Dryas may have disrupted them, pushing some groups back toward mobility. This oscillation between settlement and dispersal complicates the narrative of steady progress. It suggests vulnerability at each stage. When systems become more complex, they can also become more fragile. If a community invests in storage, hierarchy and specialization, it relies on environmental predictability. A sudden drought or cooling can unravel those dependencies. A group that once gathered in a dense village might scatter into smaller bands, carrying fragments of their former organization. In such dispersal, how much memory survives? Oral cultures can maintain astonishing precision across generations. Epic traditions, ritual chants, genealogies, all can be transmitted with care. But if a population shrinks drastically, or if key knowledge holders perish, entire branches of memory can disappear. A tradition that once described the layout of a settlement may survive only as a myth of a lost city swallowed by the sea. Across the world, flood narratives appear with striking frequency. From Mesopotamia's Epic of Gilgamesh to the Hebrew account of Noah, from Greek tales of Deucalion to stories preserved in the Americas and Oceania, the motif of overwhelming waters recurs. Some scholars interpret these as reflections of post-glacial sea level rise or regional flooding events. Others view them as archetypal narratives of renewal. Regardless of interpretation, the ubiquity of such stories hints at a deep cultural memory of environmental upheaval. It is not necessary to assume a single cataclysm erased a global civilization. The Earth does not require a singular drama to produce loss. Incremental change can be equally devastating. As shorelines advanced inland, settlements along rivers and coasts would have been abandoned repeatedly. Knowledge associated with those landscapes, fishing grounds, sacred sites, trade routes, would have been severed from physical reference points. Consider also tectonic activity. Regions such as the Eastern Mediterranean and the Pacific Rim are prone to earthquakes and tsunamis. Archaeological layers sometimes reveal sudden destruction followed by abandonment. Over thousands of years, these cycles accumulate. A settlement destroyed by seismic activity may be rebuilt once, twice, then eventually left behind. After enough centuries, its ruins blend into the earth. Erosion is patient. Even monumental structures, given sufficient time, are reduced to irregular mounds. Without context, future observers might not distinguish them from natural formations. The farther back in time one travels, the fewer intact structures remain. Sediment buries, vegetation obscures, human construction merges with geology. There is also the matter of what counts as evidence. Archaeology depends on patterns. A single anomalous artifact may be dismissed as intrusive or misdated. Only when multiple lines of data converge does a new interpretation gain acceptance. This cautious methodology guards against error, but it also means that subtle forms of organization might escape recognition if their traces are too sparse. The deep past, then, becomes a landscape of probabilities rather than certainties. Some researchers have suggested that during periods of climatic stability within the late Pleistocene, regional concentrations of population may have increased significantly. Rock shelters and open-air sites sometimes reveal dense occupation layers. Whether these clusters ever reach the scale of true urbanism is unknown, but scale itself may be misleading. A civilization need not rival later empires to qualify as organized and enduring in its own context. The very definition of civilization can narrow perception. If it requires writing, monumental architecture, and centralized governance, then by definition nothing prior to Sumer qualifies. But if it is defined more broadly as sustained social complexity, symbolic cohesion, and intergenerational transmission of knowledge, then the timeline extends far deeper. Still, extending the timeline conceptually is not the same as proving lost ages. Humility is required. The absence of evidence cannot justify grand claims. Yet the incompleteness of evidence demands restraint in dismissing possibilities outright. Between certainty and fantasy lies a narrow corridor where careful questioning resides. The Earth itself is older than imagination comfortably holds. Continental plates recycle crust over hundreds of millions of years. Mountain ranges rise and erode. Against that backdrop, even the entirety of human existence is a thin layer. If a civilization had arisen 100,000 years ago and left primarily organic traces, it is plausible that little recognizable evidence would remain. But plausible is not proven. The question, then, does not insist on hidden empires beneath every ocean shelf. It lingers more quietly. How many times did human societies approach a threshold of complexity only to retreat under pressure? How many experiments in communal life flickered briefly and vanished without stone inscriptions? History remembers what survives materially. Memory preserves what survives culturally. Between those two forms of endurance lies a vast territory of loss. As research technologies improve, as LIDAR scans penetrate dense forests, as underwater archaeology advances, as sediment cores reveal environmental shifts, fragments continue to surface. Each fragment adds nuance, rarely certainty. Each discovery expands the horizon slightly, illuminating a few more steps backward into time. Yet beyond that faint illumination stretches the immense corridor of prehistory, still largely uncharted. And within that corridor, one cannot escape the feeling that the story of humanity may not be a single ascent from ignorance to knowledge, but a tapestry woven and unwoven repeatedly, its earlier patterns faded almost beyond recognition. How many civilizations came before us? Perhaps fewer than imagination suggests. Perhaps more than current evidence reveals. The silence does not answer directly. It simply remains, vast, layered, and patient, inviting the next careful excavation, the next cautious reinterpretation, the next fragment of stone lifted from the earth. And in that patience, the question endures, unresolved and quietly persistent, like a structure buried too deep to be seen, but not entirely gone. There is a subtle discomfort in realizing that what we call the beginning is merely the beginning of what endured. Writing survives because it was pressed into clay and baked by accident or intention. Stone survives because it resists rot. But endurance is not the same as importance. The first written word does not necessarily mark the first structured society. It marks the first that left behind a medium stubborn enough to outlast erosion. If one were to compress all of human existence into a single calendar year, writing would appear only in the final days of December. Everything before it, migrations across continents, the mastery of fire, the shaping of language, the weaving of myth, would unfold in near total silence. That silence is not emptiness. It is density without documentation. Across Africa, Europe, Asia, and Australia, early humans adapted to radically different ecologies. They crossed deserts, endured icebound valleys, navigated coastlines that no longer exist. They mapped landscapes in memory. They developed cosmologies that linked stars to seasons, animals to ancestors. Such systems of knowledge are invisible to us unless they intersect with material remains. And yet there are moments when the deep past reveals flashes of unexpected organisation. Consider the site of Blombos Cave in South Africa, where engraved ochre fragments dated to around 75,000 years ago display abstract cross-hatched patterns. These are not accidental scratches. They suggest deliberate symbolic marking. Symbolism implies shared understanding. Shared understanding implies collective identity. Identity requires structure. Elsewhere, in what is now Siberia, Upper Paleolithic sites reveal elaborate dwellings constructed from mammoth bones arranged in circular formations. These were not temporary windbreaks. They required coordination, planning, and communal effort. Such architecture suggests stability, perhaps seasonal, perhaps multi-year, in landscapes often assumed to be dominated solely by mobility. What defines civilization in such contexts? Is it density of population? Is it specialization of labor? Is it monumental scale? Or is it something quieter? A sustained agreement among people about how to live together, how to allocate resources, how to interpret the world. The problem lies partly in thresholds. Modern scholarship often identifies civilization with urban centers exceeding certain population sizes, with bureaucratic record-keeping, with stratified governance. These criteria are useful for comparison, yet they may obscure forms of complexity that did not conform to later models. It is conceivable that for tens of thousands of years, humans existed in dynamic equilibrium with their environments, forming intricate social networks that left minimal physical imprint. Their architecture may have been biodegradable, their political systems flexible, their knowledge encoded in ceremony rather than inscription. Such systems could endure for centuries and then vanish with little trace. Environmental volatility intensifies this possibility. The late Pleistocene was punctuated by abrupt climate events known as Dansgaard, Yeshka cycles, during which temperatures shifted significantly within decades. Ice cores from Greenland reveal these rapid fluctuations. Human populations living through them would have faced recurring upheaval. Each upheaval presents a test. Some societies adapt, others fragment. If adaptation required dispersal into smaller groups, then even well-organized communities might dissolve periodically. Knowledge accumulated over generations could scatter. Without centralized repositories, no archives, no monumental storage, cultural continuity becomes vulnerable. There is also the quiet effect of disease. While the archaeological record preserves bones and tools, pathogens leave subtler signatures. A localized epidemic could depopulate a region, leaving settlements abandoned. In humid climates, organic materials would decay swiftly. Within centuries, forest would reclaim foundations. The Amazon basin, once thought to have supported only sparse populations before European contact, is now understood to have hosted large, organized societies. LIDAR surveys have revealed geometric earthworks and settlement patterns beneath dense canopy. These discoveries challenge long-standing assumptions about what landscapes can conceal. If such complexity remained hidden until recently, how much more might lie undiscovered beneath deserts, jungles, and seas? Caution remains necessary. Discoveries expand understanding incrementally. They do not validate grand narratives of forgotten global empires without evidence. Yet they demonstrate a recurring pattern. Earlier conclusions about simplicity often yield to evidence of sophistication when new methods emerge. The further back one looks, the thinner the record becomes. But thinness does not equate to non-existence. There is a philosophical dimension to this inquiry as well. Modern civilization often perceives itself as the pinnacle of linear progress. That perception influences how the past is framed. Earlier societies are seen as steps toward the present. But if progress is not linear, if it is cyclical, uneven, vulnerable, then the present may be one iteration among many experiments. Some scholars have proposed that human societies oscillate between complexity and simplicity in response to ecological constraints. Anthropological studies of collapse in later civilizations, such as the Maya or the societies of the Bronze Age Eastern Mediterranean, reveal how interconnected systems can fail when stress accumulates. Trade networks break, political centers fragment, populations disperse. These collapses occurred within recorded history. They left ruins visible to archaeology. Now imagine similar processes unfolding in eras where construction materials were less durable and population densities lower. The collapse of such a society might leave little more than scattered artifacts and ambiguous soil discolorations. What if the absence of visible ruins is itself a testament to fragility rather than insignificance? Even the concept of a lost civilization can mislead. Loss does not require grandeur. It can occur quietly. A culture thriving along a now submerged coastline may have sustained complex traditions for centuries. When rising seas forced migration, those traditions may have transformed or dissolved within new environments. The original centre would be forgotten, not through conspiracy, but through necessity. There is also the matter of geological deep time. Over tens of thousands of years, sedimentation can bury entire valleys. River deltas accumulate layers rapidly. Tectonic uplift can distort landscapes beyond recognition. The Earth is not a static archive. It is an active participant in erasure. When modern archaeologists excavate, they are sampling a record already filtered by erosion, decay, and chance. What remains is what survived multiple layers of destruction. Against this backdrop, the question of how many civilizations came before us becomes less about hidden continents and more about thresholds of detection. At what point does social organization leave enough trace to be recognized across millennia? How many attempts at complexity failed just below that threshold? Human cognition has been capable of abstraction and planning for tens of thousands of years. That capacity did not suddenly ignite in 4000 BCE. It was present long before. The difference may lie not in intelligence but in stability, climatic, demographic, ecological. When stability emerged in the Holocene, complexity could accumulate without constant interruption. Writing could develop, archives could form. Institutions could persist long enough to be recorded. Perhaps what we call the first civilization was simply the first to benefit from a sustained window of environmental calm. And if that is so, then the long corridor before it may contain not emptiness, but repeated gestures toward order. Brief convergences of human intention, rising and dissolving under forces beyond their control. The silence remains. It does not confirm or deny. It stretches backward, layered with sediment and uncertainty. Somewhere within it there may have been many beginnings, and if beginnings can occur more than once, then the present itself may not be singular, but another fragile emergence balanced delicately between memory and forgetting. There is a tendency to imagine the past as a ladder, each rung higher than the one before, each century more advanced than the last. But the deeper one looks into geological and archaeological time, the less the ladder resembles a straight ascent. It begins to look more like a tide, advancing and retreating, leaving faint lines along the shore. The end of the last ice age was not a gentle transition. As ice sheets retreated, they released vast quantities of meltwater into oceans. Events such as meltwater, Pulse 1a, around 14,600 years ago, may have raised global sea levels rapidly over a relatively short span. Coastal plains that had supported human groups for millennia were inundated. River mouths shifted inland. Estuaries transformed. If early societies had established semi-permanent settlements along those ancient coasts, many of their central places would now lie far beneath modern shorelines. Archaeology on land gives us only a partial map. The submerged landscapes of the Pleistocene remain largely unexplored. Even with modern sonar and submersible technologies, the scale of the task is immense. When cities like Alexandria in Egypt sank partially beneath the Mediterranean due to seismic activity, their remains were preserved in cold water, accessible to divers centuries later. But what of settlements thousands of years older, built with timber and reed? They would dissolve into sediment long before being rediscovered. The question, then, is not whether an advanced industrial civilization existed and vanished without trace. That scenario would likely leave detectable anomalies in the geological record. Rather, it is whether forms of organized, sophisticated human life arose repeatedly at scales and in materials that left minimal enduring imprint. Complexity does not always equate to monumentality. In recent decades, anthropological research has revealed that some hunter-gatherer societies exhibited hierarchical structures, seasonal aggregation sites, and ceremonial centers. The Pacific Northwest cultures of North America, for example, developed rich social stratification and monumental art, while relying primarily on fishing rather than agriculture. This demonstrates that surplus and social complexity can arise under varied ecological conditions. If similar patterns existed tens of thousands of years ago, but in regions later submerged or heavily eroded, their archaeological visibility would be faint. The Earth's crust is not an unchanging canvas. In some areas, sediment accumulates rapidly, burying ancient surfaces beneath meters of deposits. In others, erosion strips layers away entirely. Tectonic subduction recycles oceanic crust over millions of years, obliterating whatever once rested upon it. Even continental crust, though more stable, is reshaped continually by wind, water, and time. Consider the Sahara. Today it is arid and expansive, but during humid phases in the early Holocene it hosted lakes, rivers, and human settlements. Rock art scattered across now barren landscapes depicts cattle and aquatic life. As climate shifted again toward dryness, populations migrated. Their settlements eroded, leaving only isolated traces. This rhythm of flourishing and retreat suggests that human organization has always been responsive to environmental thresholds. What if the Holocene, rather than marking the first emergence of civilization, represents the first prolonged interval during which environmental conditions allowed complexity to compound without frequent collapse? Stability may be the unseen architect behind enduring empires. Genetic studies provide further nuance. Analyses of mitochondrial DNA and Y chromosome variation reveal episodes of population contraction and expansion. Around 70,000 years ago, some estimates suggest human populations were relatively small. Later expansions occurred as climate stabilized and new territories were colonized. Such demographic fluctuations influence cultural continuity. A society reduced drastically in number cannot maintain elaborate systems indefinitely. Yet even small populations can sustain intricate traditions if networks remain intact. The notion of cyclical emergence finds resonance in myth as well. Many ancient cosmologies describe previous ages of humanity, worlds destroyed by fire, flood, or darkness before a new era begins. In Mesoamerican traditions, successive suns rise and fall. In Greek thought, Hesiod speaks of ages of gold, silver, bronze, and iron. These narratives may reflect moral allegory rather than historical record, yet their recurrence across cultures hints at a deep intuition that human history may not be singular. It is tempting to dismiss such motifs as purely symbolic, but symbolism often encodes collective memory in compressed form. Even if these stories do not describe literal global catastrophes, they may preserve awareness of repeated disruption. Archaeology has documented localized collapses in recorded history. The Late Bronze Age collapse around 1200 BCE saw multiple civilizations in the Eastern Mediterranean fragment within decades. Trade networks failed, cities burned, literacy declined in some regions. For centuries afterward, the archaeological record thins before gradually thickening again. If such a collapse occurred in an era without durable inscriptions, much of it would be invisible to us. Now extend that invisibility back into deep prehistory. A complex society could disintegrate under climatic stress, its population dispersing into smaller groups. Its central places might be abandoned, looted for materials, eroded by wind and rain. Within millennia, only subtle soil changes would remain. The discipline of geoarchaeology attempts to reconstruct such lost surfaces by analysing sediment layers, pollen distribution, and micro-artefacts. These methods occasionally reveal occupation horizons far older than once assumed, but they require specific preservation conditions and targeted investigation. The absence of discovery does not imply the absence of existence. It reflects the limitations of current sampling. At the same time, intellectual honesty demands restraint. There is no conclusive evidence of advanced technological civilizations preceding those known from the archaeological record. No anomalous isotopic signatures in ancient strata point to industrial activity tens of thousands of years ago. No unmistakable artifacts of metallurgy or large-scale urbanism have been recovered from such depths. The mystery lies not in dramatic contradiction of science, but in the vastness of unexamined terrain. 300,000 years is a long span for a species capable of abstraction, cooperation, and tool-making. It is improbable that social experimentation remains static for that entire duration. It is equally improbable that every such experiment left durable monuments. Between these improbabilities rests a narrow band of humility. The more one contemplates deep time, the more fragile the present appears. Modern cities depend on intricate supply chains and digital archives. A sustained global disruption, climatic, geological or otherwise, could unravel these systems rapidly. Within a few centuries of abandonment, vegetation would engulf skyscrapers, metals would corrode, plastics might persist as microfragments, but context would be lost. Future archaeologists, human or otherwise, might struggle to reconstruct the complexity we now take for granted. If this is true for us, how much more true for societies tens of thousands of years past, whose material culture was lighter, more biodegradable, more integrated with the environment? The question of how many civilizations came before us does not demand a definitive number. It invites reflection on thresholds of preservation, thresholds of detection, thresholds of survival. Somewhere in the layered sediments of river deltas and continental shelves, there may be faint imprints of communal structures, ritual centres, or agricultural terraces now drowned or buried. They may never be found, or they may surface gradually, fragment by fragment, reshaping timelines subtly rather than dramatically. The silence of prehistory is not absolute. It is punctuated by discoveries that remind us of how much remains concealed, and so the inquiry continues, not as an accusation against established history, but as a quiet acknowledgement of its incompleteness. Perhaps there were only a few significant convergences of human complexity before the civilizations we name. Perhaps there were many small ones, rising like temporary islands in a shifting sea. The earth keeps its layers, time folds over itself. And beneath our certainty there remains a depth that has not yet spoken fully. If one steps back far enough, the entire span of recorded history becomes a thin veneer resting on an immeasurable depth. Beneath the temples of Uruk, beneath the pyramids of Giza, beneath the earliest dynasties carved into stone, there are layers upon layers of human presence that rarely enter public imagination. Hearths reduced to charcoal stains, post holes filled with darker soil, scatterings of chipped stone that once lay in careful arrangement. Each of these traces testifies to intention, to gathering, to continuity of some kind. Yet intention alone does not define civilization. The word carries weight. Cities, administration, law, stratification. It suggests density and permanence, but permanence is a fragile illusion when measured against climatic and geological scales. Even the great cities of antiquity have required constant maintenance to survive. Without caretakers, they erode quickly. One of the most revealing aspects of archaeological discovery over the past century has been the steady backward extension of complex behaviour. For a long time, scholars believed symbolic art emerged suddenly in Upper Paleolithic Europe. Then, engraved ochres and beads from Africa shifted that timeline deeper. Agriculture was once assumed to have a single origin. Now multiple centres are recognised. The peopling of the Americas was once placed firmly within the last 13,000 years. New evidence suggests earlier arrivals. Each revision reminds us that the past is not static. It expands as methods improve. Consider the Fertile Crescent before the first cities. Excavations at sites such as Jerf el Ahmar and Muribet reveal communal buildings dating back more than 11,000 years. These structures appear to have served ritual or social functions. They required coordinated labour and shared symbolic frameworks. This predates the fully developed urban systems of Sumer by millennia. What lies further back still, beneath sediment not yet excavated? In Australia, human presence stretches at least 50,000 years into the past. Aboriginal cultures maintained complex social laws and cosmologies across that immense span without written script. Songlines mapped landscapes with astonishing precision, encoding geographic and astronomical knowledge in narrative form. Such systems demonstrate that sophistication does not depend on stone monuments. If similar systems existed elsewhere in deep prehistory, they may have left little behind beyond modified landscapes now altered beyond recognition. The notion of lost civilizations often conjures images of grand architecture swallowed by jungle or sea. Yet loss can be subtle. A network of villages linked by trade and ritual might thrive for centuries before environmental shifts disperse its members. The villages decay, the network dissolves, the soil absorbs the evidence. In parts of Southeast Asia, sea levels during the last glacial maximum were far lower than today, exposing vast plains between present-day islands. These plains would have been attractive for settlement. As waters rose, inhabitants would have migrated inland or to higher ground. The physical core of their culture would now rest beneath sediment and coral growth. Marine archaeology has barely begun to chart these submerged territories. Technology improves slowly, funding fluctuates, and the ocean conceals its contents efficiently. It is conceivable that modest but organised societies once flourished there, leaving behind only faint structural outlines. Still, the absence of conclusive evidence restrains speculation. There are no confirmed remains of urban centres from 20,000 or 30,000 years ago. No metal tools of advanced manufacture embedded in ancient strata. the geological record does not display anomalies indicative of large-scale industrial activity in the deep Pleistocene. Yet complexity need not resemble modern industry. Anthropologists studying social evolution often emphasize that complexity emerges when population density, resource management, and symbolic cohesion align. These conditions can appear regionally without reaching continental scale. They can persist for centuries without leaving monumental footprints. The fragility of such systems becomes apparent when one examines later collapses. The classic Maya civilization constructed cities of stone and maintained intricate calendars. When drought and political fragmentation intensified, many urban centers were abandoned. Within decades, population levels declined sharply in certain regions. Jungle reclaimed plazas. Without ongoing maintenance, even carved stelae eroded. If those cities had been built primarily of wood and earth, how much would remain today? The same pattern echoes in the Indus Valley, where large urban centres thrived around 2600 BCE. Climatic shifts and river changes contributed to gradual decline. Writing from that civilization remains undeciphered, limiting our understanding of its internal organisation. Even within the span of recorded antiquity, vast gaps persist. Extend that uncertainty backward by tens of thousands of years, and the darkness thickens. There is also the role of chance in discovery. Many archaeological breakthroughs occur accidentally. Construction sites exposing ancient walls, storms revealing buried artifacts, farmers unearthing pottery. The known record depends partly on where people happen to dig. Entire regions remain underexplored due to political instability, dense vegetation, or lack of resources. The deep past may hold traces that simply have not yet been encountered. It is worth considering that the threshold for recognizing a civilization is partly conceptual. If archaeologists were to uncover a 15,000-year-old site with organized housing clusters, communal spaces, and evidence of sustained resource management, it would force revision. But until such a site is found and verified, the narrative remains anchored to the earliest known urban centres. The tension lies between openness and rigour. One must remain open to new evidence while resisting the allure of unfounded certainty. The history of science is filled with revisions born of patient accumulation rather than dramatic revelation. Perhaps the more profound question is not how many fully developed civilizations preceded us, but how many times human communities approached the conditions necessary for civilization and were interrupted. How many near civilizations flickered and faded before climate stabilized sufficiently for permanence to take hold. The Holocene's relative stability may have been the quiet partner in humanity's enduring ascent. It provided predictable seasons, manageable coastlines, and agricultural reliability. Under those conditions, population density could increase, specialization could flourish, writing could develop as a tool of administration. Without that stability, earlier attempts may have remained transient. In this light, the deep corridor of prehistory becomes less a void and more a field of experiments. Some experiments may have succeeded briefly, others may have dissolved quickly. Few left marks resilient enough to withstand millennia of erosion. The Earth is an unforgiving archivist. It preserves selectively, often accidentally. As layers accumulate and landscapes transform, the early chapters of human organization blur. Yet the capacity for complexity was present long before the first clay tablet. That capacity suggests possibility. Whether that possibility manifested repeatedly in structured societies beyond our current awareness remains uncertain. But uncertainty itself carries weight. It cautions against narrow definitions of origin. It reminds us that the absence of stone walls does not imply the absence of order. The question persists quietly, neither demanding nor dismissing. How many civilizations came before us? The answer may be smaller than imagination hopes, or larger than textbooks imply. Between those two extremes lies the vastness of time, layered, shifting, patient, And beneath our present cities, beneath the sediments and the sea, there may remain traces too subtle to see yet, waiting in silence for a future moment of recognition. There is a peculiar irony in the way modern civilization trusts stone and steel, as though durability were synonymous with truth. We assume that if something important existed, it would have left behind something unmistakable, a foundation too vast to ignore, an artifact too refined to dismiss. Yet the deeper one looks into Earth's rhythms, the clearer it becomes that durability is relative. Given enough time, even granite fractures. Given enough water, even mountains dissolve. If humanity had built great cities 100,000 years ago, perhaps they would be gone beyond recognition. But perhaps humanity did not build in stone at all. Perhaps the earliest convergences of complex life were quieter, woven into landscapes rather than imposed upon them. When archaeologists excavate Neolithic sites, they often find mud brick structures that have collapsed into low mounds. Without careful stratigraphic analysis, such mounds could be mistaken for natural rises. Over millennia, erosion flattens even these subtle elevations. In wetter climates, vegetation obscures them entirely. What we recognize as architecture is frequently the residue of long, patient investigation, rather than obvious monumentality. This invites a shift in perspective. Instead of asking whether a lost global civilization once spanned continents, one might ask how many times humans formed stable, interconnected societies that endured for centuries, and then unravelled before reaching the scale of recorded antiquity. Complexity is not binary. It does not switch from absent to present in a single leap. Anthropological evidence shows that social stratification can emerge among groups without agriculture, particularly where resource abundance allows surplus. Along ancient river valleys and coastal fisheries, it is conceivable that structured communities developed earlier than once assumed. If those communities relied on organic materials and flexible governance, their physical legacy would be faint. The Earth does not preserve intention easily. Take the example of volcanic eruptions. The eruption of Mount Vesuvius in 79 CE preserved Pompeii in ash, freezing daily life in startling detail. It was catastrophe that granted us such clarity. Without that ash, much would have been lost. Yet how many settlements were destroyed by eruptions that left no such preservative blanket? The Toba super-eruption, tens of thousands of years earlier, blanketed regions in ash. While its full demographic impact remains debated, such events demonstrate how quickly landscapes can be altered and populations displaced. Each displacement disrupts continuity. Language itself evolves and fractures over time. Linguistic studies reveal deep families stretching back perhaps 8 to 10,000 years with reasonable confidence. But beyond that horizon, reconstruction becomes speculative. If languages older than that existed, and they certainly did, their structures are largely unrecoverable. Along with them vanish world views and knowledge systems. Civilization, in this sense, is not merely architecture or governance. It is a web of meaning sustained through language. When language disappears, a civilization's internal coherence dissolves even if some physical traces remain. Consider also the possibility that early complex societies may have chosen mobility over monumentality. Nomadic confederations, seasonal aggregations, and ritual gatherings could produce sophisticated cultural systems without permanent cities. These systems might leave archaeological footprints only during brief annual convergences. Over thousands of years, such patterns blur into scattered evidence. The notion that progress is inevitable is itself a modern inheritance. Archaeological records of later collapses challenge that assumption. The Akkadian Empire, once dominant in Mesopotamia, declined during a period of severe drought around 2200 BCE. Ice core data and sediment records suggest abrupt aridification across regions. Urban centres were abandoned, political structures fragmented. If such collapse occurred before writing, the narrative would be almost invisible. Now extend that invisibility backward into a time when writing did not yet exist. A drought, a cooling event, or a disease outbreak could disperse populations and reduce density below the threshold necessary for sustaining hierarchy. Knowledge requiring centralized coordination might be lost. What remains would be scattered villages, their connection to a prior order forgotten. The Younger Dryas offers another window into vulnerability. Even without accepting contested impact hypotheses, the climatic reversal itself is clear in the geological record. Sudden cooling would have stressed plant and animal resources. Communities experimenting with sedentism may have been forced to revert to mobility. The archaeological layers show adjustments, but the emotional reality of such transitions is beyond recovery. Human societies, like ecosystems, operate within constraints. When constraints shift abruptly, resilience varies. There is also the psychological dimension. Modern observers project backward an assumption that earlier humans were less capable. Yet skeletal remains show brains comparable in size and structure to ours. Artistic evidence demonstrates imagination. Burial practices reveal spirituality. There is no biological barrier that would have prevented complex organization tens of thousands of years ago. The barrier may have been environmental consistency. Only in relatively stable climates can agriculture flourish reliably. Only with predictable harvests can surplus accumulate. Only with surplus can specialization deepen. Writing may arise when administration becomes necessary to manage surplus and hierarchy. In this model, civilization is less an invention of intelligence and more a product of ecological timing. If this is true, then earlier climates, oscillating and harsh, may have allowed brief surges of organization that never stabilized long enough to leave enduring marks. These surges would not resemble later empires. They might resemble tightly knit networks, ceremonial hubs, or proto-urban clusters. When disrupted, they would fragment. From a geological perspective, 20,000 years is a blink. From a human perspective, it is unfathomable. Within such spans, repeated cycles of aggregation and dispersal could occur without producing a single enduring monument. The ocean continues to rise and fall across glacial cycles. Deserts advance and retreat. River systems carve new channels. Beneath layers of sediment, earlier surfaces remain inaccessible. Some may hold subtle signs of past organization. Others may hold nothing more than natural deposits. Scientific caution demands acknowledgement of limits. There is no verified evidence of advanced technological civilizations predating those we know. There are no artifacts of lost machinery embedded in ancient rock layers. The narrative remains anchored in what has been excavated and dated. Yet within that anchored narrative lies room for humility. The archaeological record is incomplete. It is filtered by preservation bias, by funding priorities, by accessibility. How many civilizations came before us? The answer may depend on how one defines civilization. If it requires writing, monumental architecture, and centralized state power, then perhaps the number is small. If it encompasses sustained social complexity and symbolic cohesion, then the number may be larger, though difficult to count. What is certain is that humanity's capacity for organization predates our earliest written words by tens of thousands of years. What is uncertain is how often that capacity crystallized into structured societies that endured long enough to be recognized across millennia. The silence does not argue. It does not confirm hidden continents or secret archives buried beneath ice. It simply stretches backward, vast and layered, containing more time than memory can comfortably hold, and somewhere within that layered expanse, beneath the shifting crust and the quiet sea, there may be traces of attempts, fragile convergences of human intention that rose, faltered and faded before anyone thought to press their story into clay. There is a quiet arrogance in believing that history begins where our evidence begins. It is a habit of the present to assume that what has not been found did not exist. Yet the ground beneath every excavation reminds us that absence can be the product of concealment, not non-existence. Soil layers fold over one another, rivers shift their courses, forests root themselves into abandoned foundations. What survives is rarely a complete narrative, it is a fragment. The deeper one contemplates the span of human existence, the more striking the imbalance becomes. 300,000 years of anatomical modernity, perhaps 200,000 years of language in some evolving form, tens of thousands of years of symbolic behaviour, and yet only the last 5,000 are documented with script. That leaves more than 98% of our story without written testimony. During the late Pleistocene, human populations were dispersed across continents. Small bands navigated glacial valleys, temperate forests, arid plains. But small does not necessarily mean simple. Ethnographic studies of recent hunter-gatherer societies reveal intricate kinship systems, trade alliances, seasonal ceremonies, and conflict resolution mechanisms. These systems function without bureaucracies, yet they can be remarkably stable. Scale again becomes the dividing line. When population density remains low, hierarchy may remain fluid. Leadership may shift according to context, hunting, ritual, negotiation. Such fluidity leaves little archaeological signature. There are no royal tombs, no palaces, no inscriptions declaring authority. Yet cohesion can persist for generations. If climate shifts or resource patterns change, such societies can disperse without catastrophic collapse. They fragment into smaller units, maintaining aspects of culture while losing others. In that fragmentation, continuity becomes difficult to trace archaeologically. The record we possess privileges dramatic concentration, cities, fortifications, monuments. It overlooks long durations of decentralized complexity. Consider also the implications of fire. Controlled use of fire dates back hundreds of thousands of years. Fire alters landscapes intentionally. It can be used to manage vegetation, to drive game, to encourage certain plant species. Aboriginal Australian fire regimes, for example, shaped ecosystems deliberately over millennia. Such environmental engineering leaves subtle signatures, charcoal layers, shifts in pollen, but not monumental ruins. If ancient societies elsewhere practiced similar landscape management, their influence might appear natural to later observers. In South America, recent studies of the Amazon basin have revealed anthropogenic soils known as terra preta, rich, dark earth, created by pre-Columbian populations through deliberate management of organic waste and charcoal. These soils persist as evidence of sustained habitation and ecological understanding. Yet until relatively recently, large-scale settlement in the Amazon was underestimated. What other regions conceal similar traces beneath assumptions of simplicity? The conversation about lost civilizations often drifts toward extremes, either outright dismissal or extravagant claims. Between those poles lies a quieter, more demanding position, to acknowledge that human social organization likely experimented in many forms across deep time, most of which left only faint marks. The younger Dryas, again, offers a point of reflection. Even without invoking debated impact scenarios, the abrupt climatic cooling is real. Pollen records and isotopic data show ecological disruption. Communities dependent on specific plant or animal cycles would have faced stress. Some may have adapted by intensifying cooperation. Others may have migrated. Migration itself complicates continuity. When populations move, they carry knowledge with them, but they also encounter new environments. Some traditions become obsolete, others transform. If a migrating group had once lived in a relatively dense, semi-sedentary settlement, that memory might fade over generations of mobility. There is also the influence of competition. When distinct groups interact, cultural exchange occurs. So does conflict. archaeological evidence of interpersonal violence appears in various prehistoric contexts: skeletal trauma, fortified enclosures. Organised conflict suggests structured groups capable of collective action. It suggests alliances, boundaries, strategies. Such organisation does not require cities, yet it reflects social complexity. If prehistoric societies developed regional networks with defined territories and exchange systems, they may have resembled later chiefdoms on a smaller scale. Should climatic stress fracture those networks, their collapse might not leave monumental debris, only dispersed artifacts and interrupted occupation layers. Time amplifies fragility. Over tens of thousands of years, even repeated episodes of structured life could vanish from clear view. Soil acidity dissolves bone. Plant roots displace stones. Floodplains bury surfaces under meters of silt. What remains accessible to archaeologists represents only those sites fortunate enough to survive under favourable conditions. Even then, interpretation evolves. Sites once classified as simple camps are reinterpreted as aggregation centres when new evidence emerges. The threshold for recognising complexity shifts as theoretical frameworks change. There is also the psychological dimension of deep time. It is difficult for the human mind to grasp scales beyond a few millennia. When confronted with the enormity of 300,000 years, imagination falters. The temptation arises either to compress the span into a simple narrative or to fill it with dramatic speculation. Perhaps the most honest position is to accept uncertainty without embellishment. The Earth's crust contains no clear signature of industrial-scale civilization prior to the recent epoch. Geochemical markers of modern industry are identifiable in sediment layers of the last century. Their absence in older strata suggests that if earlier civilizations existed, they did not industrialize in ways comparable to ours. But industrialization is not the only measure of advancement. A civilization oriented toward ecological balance, built from renewable materials, leaving minimal pollution, might leave little trace after sufficient time. Such a society would not alter atmospheric chemistry detectably. It would not mine on a scale visible millions of years later. It would not produce synthetic compounds embedded in rock. Its disappearance would be quiet. The fragility of the present underscores this possibility. Modern infrastructure appears solid, yet without maintenance it deteriorates rapidly. Highways crack, dams silt up, power grids fail. Within centuries of abandonment, forests reclaim concrete. Within millennia, tectonic processes and erosion would scatter even reinforced structures. If our own civilization is so vulnerable to time, how much more vulnerable were those of deep antiquity, if they existed at all? The question persists not as an accusation against current scholarship, but as an invitation to humility. The absence of visible ruins older than 12,000 years does not conclusively prove the absence of complex societies. It reflects the interplay between preservation, detection, and definition. How many civilizations came before us? The number may be small, it may be none beyond those we recognize, or it may include a handful of fragile convergences that rose and fell in landscapes now altered beyond recognition. The silence offers no arithmetic, it offers depth. And in that depth, beneath sediment and sea, beneath shifting climate and forgotten language, there remains the possibility that humanity has stood at thresholds more than once, gathering, organizing, imagining, only to step back into dispersion when the ground beneath them changed. The corridor of prehistory stretches still, immense and patient, holding within it answers that may never fully surface. There is a quiet arrogance in believing that history begins where our evidence begins. It is a habit of the present to assume that what has not been found did not exist. Yet the ground beneath every excavation reminds us that absence can be the product of concealment, not non-existence. Soil layers fold over one another, rivers shift their courses, forests root themselves into abandoned foundations. What survives is rarely a complete narrative. it is a fragment. The deeper one contemplates the span of human existence, the more striking the imbalance becomes. 300,000 years of anatomical modernity, perhaps 200,000 years of language in some evolving form, tens of thousands of years of symbolic behaviour, and yet only the last 5,000 are documented with script. That leaves more than 98% of our story without written testimony. During the late Pleistocene, human populations were dispersed across continents. Small bands navigated glacial valleys, temperate forests, arid plains. But small does not necessarily mean simple. Ethnographic studies of recent hunter-gatherer societies reveal intricate kinship systems, trade alliances, seasonal ceremonies, and conflict resolution mechanisms. These systems function without bureaucracies, yet they can be remarkably stable. Scale, again, becomes the dividing line. When population density remains low, hierarchy may remain fluid. Leadership may shift according to context, hunting, ritual, negotiation. Such fluidity leaves little archaeological signature. There are no royal tombs, no palaces, no inscriptions declaring authority. Yet cohesion can persist for generations. If climate shifts or resource patterns change, such societies can disperse without catastrophic collapse. They fragment into smaller units, maintaining aspects of culture while losing others. In that fragmentation, continuity becomes difficult to trace archaeologically. The record we possess privileges dramatic concentration, cities, fortifications, monuments. It overlooks long durations of decentralized complexity. Consider also the implications of fire. Controlled use of fire dates back hundreds of thousands of years. Fire alters landscapes intentionally. It can be used to manage vegetation, to drive game, to encourage certain plant species. Aboriginal Australian fire regimes, for example, shaped ecosystems deliberately over millennia. Such environmental engineering leaves subtle signatures, charcoal layers, shifts in pollen, but not monumental ruins. If ancient societies elsewhere practiced similar landscape management, their influence might appear natural to later observers. In South America, recent studies of the Amazon basin have revealed anthropogenic soils known as terra preta, rich, dark earth, created by pre-Columbian populations through deliberate management of organic waste and charcoal. These soils persist as evidence of sustained habitation and ecological understanding. Yet until relatively recently, large-scale settlement in the Amazon was underestimated. What other regions conceal similar traces beneath assumptions of simplicity? The conversation about lost civilizations often drifts toward extremes, either outright dismissal or extravagant claims. Between those poles lies a quieter, more demanding position, to acknowledge that human social organization likely experimented in many forms across deep time, most of which left only faint marks. The younger Dryas, again, offers a point of reflection. Even without invoking debated impact scenarios, the abrupt climatic cooling is real. Pollen records and isotopic data show ecological disruption. Communities dependent on specific plant or animal cycles would have faced stress. Some may have adapted by intensifying cooperation. Others may have migrated. Migration itself complicates continuity. When populations move, they carry knowledge with them, but they also encounter new environments. Some traditions become obsolete, others transform. If a migrating group had once lived in a relatively dense semi-sedentary settlement, that memory might fade over generations of mobility. There is also the influence of competition. When distinct groups interact, cultural exchange occurs. So does conflict. Archaeological evidence of interpersonal violence appears in various prehistoric contexts: skeletal trauma, fortified enclosures. Organized conflict suggests structured groups capable of collective action. It suggests alliances, boundaries, strategies. Such organization does not require cities, yet it reflects social complexity. If prehistoric societies developed regional networks with defined territories, and exchange systems, they may have resembled later chiefdoms on a smaller scale. Should climatic stress fracture those networks, their collapse might not leave monumental debris, only dispersed artifacts and interrupted occupation layers. Time amplifies fragility. Over tens of thousands of years, even repeated episodes of structured life could vanish from clear view. Soil acidity dissolves bone. Plant roots displace stones. Floodplains bury surfaces under meters of silt. What remains accessible to archaeologists represents only those sites fortunate enough to survive under favourable conditions. Even then, interpretation evolves. Sites once classified as simple camps are reinterpreted as aggregation centres when new evidence emerges. The threshold for recognising complexity shifts as theoretical frameworks change. There is also the psychological dimension of deep time. It is difficult for the human mind to grasp scales beyond a few millennia. When confronted with the enormity of 300,000 years, imagination falters. The temptation arises either to compress the span into a simple narrative or to fill it with dramatic speculation. Perhaps the most honest position is to accept uncertainty without embellishment. The Earth's crust contains no clear signature of industrial-scale civilization prior to the recent epoch. Geochemical markers of modern industry are identifiable in sediment layers of the last century. Their absence in older strata suggests that if earlier civilizations existed, they did not industrialize in ways comparable to ours. But industrialization is not the only measure of advancement. A civilization oriented toward ecological balance, built from renewable materials, leaving minimal pollution, might leave little trace after sufficient time. Such a society would not alter atmospheric chemistry detectably. It would not mine on a scale visible millions of years later. It would not produce synthetic compounds embedded in rock. Its disappearance would be quiet. The fragility of the present underscores this possibility. Modern infrastructure appears solid, yet without maintenance it deteriorates rapidly. Highways crack, dams silt up, power grids fail. Within centuries of abandonment, forests reclaim concrete. Within millennia, tectonic processes and erosion would scatter even reinforced structures. If our own civilization is so vulnerable to time, how much more vulnerable were those of deep antiquity, if they existed at all? The question persists not as an accusation against current scholarship, but as an invitation to humility. The absence of visible ruins older than 12,000 years does not conclusively prove the absence of complex societies. It reflects the interplay between preservation, detection, and definition. How many civilizations came before us? The number may be small, it may be none beyond those we recognize, or it may include a handful of fragile convergences that rose and fell in landscapes now altered beyond recognition. The silence offers no arithmetic, it offers depth. And in that depth, beneath sediment and sea, beneath shifting climate and forgotten language, there remains the possibility that humanity has stood at thresholds more than once, gathering, organizing, imagining, only to step back into dispersion when the ground beneath them changed. The corridor of prehistory stretches still, immense and patient, holding within it answers that may never fully surface. There is something almost unsettling about how easily the earth forgets. Not in the way memory fades gently, but in the way landscapes can be rewritten without hesitation. Rivers alter their channels, glaciers grind valleys into new shapes, coastlines shift inward and outward with the pulse of ice. If a settlement once stood beside a riverbank 20,000 years ago, that river may now flow kilometers away, or not at all. When archaeologists reconstruct ancient maps, they often begin by imagining a different world. Lower seas, colder winds, grasslands where there is now ocean, forest where there is now desert. The continents themselves appear familiar, but their edges are different, blurred by time. Human communities once moved across those vanished thresholds, and movement leaves little behind. One of the enduring assumptions in popular imagination is that civilization must leave an obvious scar, that if it were present, it would remain visible. Yet even within recorded history, entire cities have disappeared so thoroughly that they were long believed mythical. Troy was once dismissed as legend until excavation revealed layered ruins beneath a Turkish hill. The Hittite capital of Hattusa was lost for centuries. Angkor was swallowed by jungle. These rediscoveries occurred within the last few thousand years of history. They survived because stone endured and because the sites remained on land. What of sites far older, submerged or eroded beyond clear geometry? Marine geologists mapping continental shelves have identified ancient river channels now drowned. These channels once supported life. In the Persian Gulf region, there is speculation that during periods of lower sea level, a vast basin may have served as a refuge for human populations. As waters rose, inhabitants would have migrated outward, carrying stories of a homeland lost beneath the sea. Whether such refugees hosted organised societies beyond small communities remains unknown. But the possibility underscores how much of the human past may lie underwater. Technological limitations have long constrained exploration of submerged prehistory. Only recently have sonar mapping and submersible robotics begun to uncover structures that might represent human construction. Even then, distinguishing natural formations from deliberate architecture is difficult, debate is common, skepticism is necessary. Yet the debate itself signals something important. The record is incomplete. Beyond water and erosion, there is also burial. In floodplains such as the Nile or the Tigris-Euphrates, sediment accumulates rapidly. Ancient surfaces can lie meters beneath present ground level. Excavation requires resources and stability that are not always available. Vast regions remain underexplored. If a complex society existed in such a floodplain 15,000 years ago, its remains might be deeply buried, indistinguishable without targeted excavation. Climate shifts complicate the picture further. The Sahara, now expansive and dry, has experienced humid periods during which lakes dotted its interior. Archaeological evidence shows human habitation around these paleo lakes. When aridity returned, populations migrated. Over time, wind redistributed sediments, obscuring many traces. In this rhythm of greening and drying, societies may have flourished temporarily. Their organisation may have been sophisticated within their ecological niche. Yet once the niche vanished, their material culture would degrade under harsh conditions. The fragility of organic materials cannot be overstated. Wood, fibre, leather, even certain stone types degrade under heat and moisture. Unless conditions are unusually favourable, extreme dryness, freezing temperatures, anaerobic waterlogging, artefacts decay rapidly. Thus, the absence of monumental ruins from deep prehistory may reflect preservation bias rather than absence of organised life. Still, caution tempers imagination. There is no verified evidence of vast, technologically advanced civilizations predating known ancient cultures. The geological record does not reveal anomalous industrial residues from tens of thousands of years ago. Radiometric dating methods have been refined carefully. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. The tension lies between what is demonstrable and what is conceivable. Anthropology suggests that human societies are flexible, capable of forming diverse structures depending on environment. In resource-rich settings, aggregation can occur. In marginal settings, dispersion prevails. Both states may alternate over centuries. Imagine a coastal society 10,000 years before Sumer. It gathers seasonally at a central site for ritual and exchange. It constructs wooden platforms, reed dwellings, and symbolic carvings. It manages fisheries with knowledge accumulated over generations. Then, as seas rise and storms intensify, the central site becomes untenable. The community fragments. Some move inland. Others disperse along the coast. Within a few centuries, the central site lies underwater. Wooden structures rot, carvings decay. Only stone tools remain scattered, indistinct among natural debris. Would future archaeologists recognise that as a civilization? The definition becomes crucial. If civilization demands urban density and writing, perhaps not. If it includes sustained social complexity and coordinated ecological management, perhaps yes. Human brains capable of abstraction and foresight have existed for far longer than cities. This fact alone invites humility in drawing rigid lines between primitive and civilized. The tools may have differed, but the cognitive substrate was similar. Another dimension emerges when considering cultural transmission. Oral traditions can preserve astonishing detail across centuries, yet they are vulnerable to disruption. Conquest, migration, epidemic. Any of these can sever chains of memory. Throughout history, conquerors have destroyed libraries and suppressed local knowledge. The burning of the Library of Alexandria is often invoked symbolically to represent lost wisdom, though its history is complex. Regardless of that specific event, the destruction of archives has occurred repeatedly. If such destruction happened in preliterate contexts, its impact would be even more absolute. The Earth does not archive intention automatically. Humans must choose to preserve. In the deep past, preservation may not have been a priority. Survival, adaptation, and mobility could have outweighed permanence. Monumental construction might have seemed impractical in unstable climates. Thus, the absence of ancient stone cities older than Göbekli Tepe does not necessarily equate to the absence of structured societies. It reflects the convergence of stability, materials, and preservation. Perhaps civilization is not a singular invention but a recurring tendency, a pattern that emerges when conditions allow and recedes when they do not. Under this view, the Holocene represents an unusually long window during which accumulation outpaced erasure. Before that window, attempts may have arisen and dissolved too quickly to fossilize in architecture. The question then becomes less about counting hidden empires and more about recognizing the fragility of thresholds. How often did human groups gather into structured systems only to disperse under pressure? How many times did complexity approach durability but fall short? The silence does not offer a census. It offers perspective. 300,000 years of humanity. 5,000 years of writing. Between them stretches a vast landscape of possibility and loss. And somewhere within that landscape, beneath layers of sediment and shifting sea, there may be faint echoes of gatherings long forgotten. Societies that lived fully in their moment, organised in ways meaningful to them, then faded without stone to remember them. The Earth keeps its secrets not out of malice, but because time is patient, and time, more than any conqueror or catastrophe, is the greatest eraser of all. There is another possibility that lingers quietly beneath all of this. Not that entire continents of lost empires wait to be discovered, but that the way we measure civilization may itself conceal earlier forms of order. The criteria we use today were shaped by the civilizations that survived long enough to define the standard. Writing, monumental architecture, centralized governance, metallurgy. These are benchmarks drawn from societies that left clear physical signatures. But what if the earliest complex societies were organized around principles that resist archaeological visibility? In many parts of the world, sacred spaces were defined not by walls but by alignment. Stones placed in subtle configurations, wooden posts forming circles, earthwork shaped gradually over generations. Such constructions can erode into near invisibility unless carefully excavated. In Britain, sites like Stonehenge represent the stone-surviving fraction of a broader landscape of timber circles and ritual avenues that once existed. The wooden elements decayed. The stone endured. If one projects that pattern backward tens of thousands of years, it is conceivable that ritual and governance were structured through materials that rarely survive deep time. There is also the dimension of astronomical awareness. Long before formal astronomy was recorded in cuneiform or hieroglyph, humans observed the sky. Seasonal migrations depended on understanding celestial cycles. Hunter-gatherers tracked solstices and lunar rhythms. Some archaeologists argue that certain Paleolithic cave sites may encode celestial patterns, though such interpretations remain debated. Still, the sky has always been a shared text. Knowledge of celestial cycles could unify groups across wide territories. Shared cosmology creates cohesion. Cohesion fosters coordinated action. If early societies used astronomical markers to structure seasonal gatherings or regulate social exchange, they may have achieved a form of temporal organization sophisticated yet materially light. What remains of such systems after 20,000 years? A scattering of stones, a cave painting whose meaning is partially obscured, a faint alignment barely distinguishable from chance. The archaeological record also reveals that early humans engaged in long-distance exchange networks much earlier than once assumed. Marine shells found inland, obsidian traced to specific volcanic sources hundreds of kilometers away. These indicate communication routes. Trade requires trust and shared norms. Shared norms require governance of some form, even if informal. Such networks could represent embryonic civilizations, webs of interaction without central cities. Climate again becomes decisive. The Pleistocene's instability may have prevented these networks from densifying permanently. A prolonged drought could sever trade routes. Glacial advance could isolate regions. Population density might decline below the threshold required to sustain elaborate systems. When density falls, complexity thins. Even within recorded history, urban centres depend on critical mass. When that mass disperses, institutions collapse, writing declines, specialised crafts disappear. In the Eastern Mediterranean after the Bronze Age collapse, literacy in certain scripts vanished for centuries before re-emerging in new forms. If literacy can disappear within documented time, how easily could pre-literate complexity vanish without trace? There is also the matter of cognitive archaeology, the study of how material remains reflect mental worlds. Artifacts suggest planning depth, abstraction, and symbolic reasoning in humans far older than the first cities. Engraved objects from Blombos, beads from North Africa, carved figurines from Europe, all point toward a mind capable of constructing shared narratives. Shared narratives are the backbone of civilization. Without them, no large-scale cooperation is possible. With them, even small groups can form resilient identities. If such identities expanded into broader alliances under favourable conditions, they may have approached thresholds of civilization long before writing crystallized those structures. Yet thresholds are delicate. It is possible that the Holocene did not introduce complexity but stabilized it. Under predictable seasons and manageable sea levels, agriculture flourished consistently. Surplus accumulated. Populations grew. Hierarchies hardened. Writing emerged as a practical necessity. Before that, complexity may have been recurrent but transient. Some researchers have speculated about paleo-civilizations that rose during interglacial periods and vanished during glacial advances. There is no direct evidence for large-scale urban systems in such distant epochs, and the geological record does not support advanced industrial activity. Still, the cyclical nature of climate invites contemplation of recurring human experiments. The Earth has experienced multiple interglacials over the past several 100,000 years. Homo sapiens emerged during one of these cycles. It is conceivable that during particularly favourable intervals, populations increased regionally. Whether those increases translated into organised city-like systems remains uncertain. The evidence does not confirm, it does not deny. It simply remains incomplete. Another dimension to consider is intentional erasure. In recorded history, conquerors often dismantle the monuments of predecessors. Temples are repurposed, inscriptions are chiselled away. Entire cultural narratives are overwritten. If similar processes occurred in pre-literate contexts, physical destruction combined with material fragility would leave almost nothing. But such speculation must be approached cautiously. Without evidence, it remains hypothesis. What can be said with confidence is that the Earth is not a perfect archive. Preservation bias shapes what we know. Stone and clay endure, wood and fibre vanish, arid deserts preserve, humid jungles erase. Tectonic stability maintains, subduction obliterates. Against this selective preservation stands the immense timescale of human existence. 300,000 years. Within that span, modern humans endured volcanic eruptions, glacial maxima, sea level rise, droughts, and migrations across continents. They adapted repeatedly. They learned. They transmitted knowledge through language and ritual. It would be surprising if they did not experiment with varied forms of social organization along the way. Whether those experiments ever reached the scale and density we associate with civilization remains an open question. Perhaps they did not. Perhaps writing and urbanism truly emerged only once environmental conditions allowed sustained accumulation. Or perhaps there were earlier convergences that approached complexity, only to dissolve before reaching archaeological visibility. The answer may never be fully known. And yet the question itself reshapes perspective. It invites recognition of how thin our documented history is relative to our species' lifespan. It tempers certainty. It reminds us that absence of monumental ruin is not equivalent to absence of human intention. Somewhere beneath shifting sands and silent seas, beneath layers of sediment that record floods and droughts, lie fragments of lives lived with as much meaning as our own. Whether those lives coalesced into civilizations by our standards may remain uncertain, but the depth of time ensures that what we call the first was not the first human effort to belong together. The corridor stretches backward, dim and immense, and within it there may have been more beginnings than we can count. Beginnings that rose, organized, and then yielded quietly to the patient hand of time. There is a final layer to consider in this long descent through silence. Not only what may have been lost to erosion or rising seas, but what may have been lost through transformation. Civilizations do not always vanish in fire or flood. Sometimes they dissolve slowly into something else. Their symbols are reinterpreted. Their sacred sites are repurposed. Their knowledge is absorbed and renamed. In such cases, nothing is truly destroyed. Yet the original shape becomes unrecognizable. Archaeology has shown repeatedly that cultural continuity often hides beneath apparent rupture. The temples of one society may be built atop the foundations of another. Deities are renamed. Rituals are adapted. When conquerors arrive, they do not always erase. Sometimes they merge. Over centuries, origins blur. If such layering occurred even in pre-literate epochs, then earlier forms of organized life may persist only as faint substrata beneath later traditions. Mythology provides subtle hints of this possibility. Many ancient cultures speak of primordial teachers, beings who brought agriculture, law, astronomy, or writing. In Mesopotamian tradition, the figure of Oannes emerges from the sea to instruct humanity. In Mesoamerica, Quetzalcoatl is remembered as a civilizing force. These figures may represent symbolic personifications of innovation, yet they also reflect an intuition that knowledge arrives from a prior source. Whether that source was external or ancestral is open to interpretation. What matters is the pattern. Civilizations remember that something came before them. The Sumerian king list, for example, records antediluvian rulers with reigns stretching tens of thousands of years before a great flood resets the order. Modern scholarship interprets these exaggerated reign lengths symbolically, perhaps reflecting astronomical cycles or mythic cosmology. Yet embedded within the list is the notion of prior ages, of continuity broken by catastrophe. Flood narratives, as mentioned earlier, appear globally. While not evidence of a singular worldwide event, they may encode memory of regional inundations during post-glacial sea level rise. The end of the Ice Age did not occur overnight, but it did transform coastlines dramatically. Communities living near water would have experienced the slow encroachment as a profound loss. Over generations, such loss could crystallize into myth. If organized societies once existed in low-lying coastal regions, their displacement by rising seas would not only erase physical structures but scatter populations inland. Cultural memory might survive in altered form, stripped of geographic specificity. This gradual erasure differs from sudden catastrophe. It leaves little dramatic evidence, only migration patterns and submerged landscapes. There is also the matter of technological regression. It is commonly assumed that technology moves forward cumulatively, yet history shows regression is possible. After the fall of Rome in Western Europe, certain engineering techniques and infrastructural systems declined. Literacy rates fell in some regions, urban density decreased. If regression can occur within documented eras, it could have occurred in deeper time as well. Imagine a semi-urbanized society dependent on predictable fisheries and river flooding. A prolonged drought disrupts food supply. Population density declines. Specialized crafts are no longer sustainable. Knowledge once centralized disperses. Within a few centuries, the society reorganizes into smaller decentralized units. Writing, if it existed, is no longer maintained. The material culture shifts. Archaeologically, such regression might appear as a transition from complexity to simplicity, without clear narrative context. The deeper one contemplates this pattern, the more fragile civilization appears. It is not an inevitable destination, but a precarious balance between environment, population, and shared meaning. Modern civilization rests upon layers of accumulated knowledge: scientific, technological, administrative. It depends on global networks. Its archives are digital, intangible, reliant on energy. If disrupted, vast quantities of information could vanish quickly. Against this fragility, the silence of prehistory feels less mysterious and more instructive. 300,000 years ago, humans began to shape tools with intention. 70,000 years ago, they engraved patterns and adorned themselves with beads. 10,000 years ago, they gathered in large communal sites like Göbekli Tepe. 5,000 years ago, they pressed symbols into clay. Each threshold marks not a sudden awakening, but a convergence of conditions. Perhaps there were earlier convergences, not as monumental as those we recognize, but significant within their ecological context. Perhaps they flourished for centuries and then receded, leaving only faint traces beneath layers of sediment. Or perhaps the Holocene truly represents the first prolonged opportunity for civilization to stabilize, and before it, complexity never surpassed certain thresholds. The evidence does not deliver a final verdict. What it does reveal is that our understanding of deep time remains provisional. New technologies, LIDAR scanning, sediment core analysis, ancient DNA sequencing, continue to revise timelines. Sites once thought peripheral become central. Chronologies stretch backward gradually. Each discovery reminds us that certainty in archaeology is earned slowly. How many civilizations came before us? The question may never yield a precise number. Civilization is not a discrete object to be counted like artifacts in a museum. It is a process, an arrangement of relationships, resources, and ideas. If that process emerged repeatedly in localized forms, then perhaps many small civilizations preceded the ones we name. If it required the stability unique to the Holocene, then perhaps ours is among the earliest sustained examples. Either way, the silence before writing is not empty of humanity. It is filled with lives lived fully in their own present, with communities that navigated ice and flood, drought and abundance. The earth keeps their memory imperfectly. Time erodes structure and language alike. And as we stand within our own brief window of stability, surrounded by archives and architecture, it may be worth remembering that permanence is always conditional. The corridor behind us is vast and largely unlit. It may contain fewer lost civilizations than imagination suggests. It may contain more beginnings than we can verify. What it certainly contains is depth, a depth that humbles the present and softens any claim that we are the first to gather, to organize, to dream of endurance. Somewhere in that depth, beneath shifting seas and forgotten names, there were people who believed their world would last, and like us, they could not see how patient time truly is. There is one more way to approach the question, and it requires turning the gaze away from ruins and toward probability. Not the probability of hidden empires buried beneath every ocean shelf, but the probability that across 300,000 years of human existence, the conditions for organized, semi-complex societies emerged more than once. 300,000 years is not a short prelude. It is a vast arena of experimentation. Modern humans spread out of Africa in multiple waves, adapting to tundra, savanna, rainforest, and coastline. They crossed into Australia by at least 50,000 years ago, implying maritime capability. They reached the Americas at least 15,000 years ago, perhaps earlier. These migrations required coordination, planning, and shared vision. They required trust within groups and knowledge of seasons and resources. The cognitive foundation for civilization was already present. The limiting factor, then, may not have been intelligence but continuity. To sustain large, dense populations over generations requires stable food systems. Stable food systems require predictable climate. The late Pleistocene rarely offered such predictability for long. Ice sheets expanded and contracted. Sea levels rose and fell dramatically. Regional climates oscillated within decades. In such a world, perhaps human societies hovered near thresholds repeatedly, forming hubs of trade and ritual when conditions allowed, then dispersing when conditions shifted. This image does not demand monumental cities older than those we know. It suggests instead a mosaic of transient complexities, each adapted to its moment. Archaeological evidence hints at such thresholds. At sites like Göbekli Tepe, large-scale coordinated construction predates fully domesticated agriculture. This suggests that ritual aggregation may have preceded and perhaps catalyzed farming. If so, then social cohesion was strong enough to organize labor on a significant scale, even before permanent cities. Why, then, did such aggregation not stabilize earlier or in other places? Perhaps it did, but the record is fragmentary. Perhaps other aggregation centers existed in regions later submerged or heavily eroded, or perhaps Göbekli Tepe represents one of the earliest instances where climatic conditions allowed complexity to persist long enough to fossilize in stone. The Younger Dryas looms again as a dividing line. Its abrupt cooling would have disrupted early experiments in sedentism. Some archaeologists argue that the return to warmer conditions afterward created a renewed push toward agriculture, as communities sought more reliable food sources in an unstable environment. Under this interpretation, civilization did not appear out of nowhere. It emerged from repeated stress. If stress shaped civilization, then earlier stress events may have similarly catalyzed organization, only for subsequent disruptions to dissolve it. The archaeological silence of earlier epochs may therefore reflect not the absence of civilization, but the absence of durability. Consider how quickly organic materials decay under certain conditions. In tropical regions, wooden structures can disappear within decades if not maintained. Even stone can weather rapidly in humid climates. If early societies thrived in such regions, their material remains might have little chance of surviving tens of thousands of years. This preservation bias skews perception toward arid regions where mud brick and stone endure. There is also the issue of scale. Modern civilization spans continents and leaves unmistakable geochemical markers, plastics, radionuclides, industrial pollutants. Such markers are absent in deep Pleistocene layers. This absence strongly suggests that no industrial-scale civilization preceded ours in the recent geological past. But industrial scale is a modern phenomenon. Earlier civilizations did not alter global chemistry dramatically. They shaped local environments, forests cleared, irrigation canals dug, terraces carved. Over millennia, these modifications can erode back into the landscape. The Maya once transformed large areas of Mesoamerica with agriculture and urban construction. After abandonment, jungle reclaimed their cities. Without excavation, many remained hidden for centuries. If jungle can obscure stone within 1,000 years, what can tens of thousands accomplish? The earth is both creator and eraser. There is also the matter of humility in interpretation. Archaeology operates on evidence, and evidence accumulates slowly. It resists sweeping conclusions unsupported by data. Yet it also evolves. Discoveries that once seemed impossible, such as large earthwork complexes beneath Amazonian canopy, are now documented through LiDAR technology. What future technologies might reveal about submerged Paleolithic coastlines? It is possible that the number of true civilizations preceding the ones we know is small. It is equally possible that small, regionally complex societies arose and fell repeatedly, never crossing the threshold into durable urbanism. The distinction matters less than the recognition of fragility. Civilization is not an inevitable arc upward. It is a delicate equilibrium between environment, population density, and shared symbolic order. Remove one component and the structure can dissolve. If earlier equilibria existed, they may have lasted centuries, long enough for those living within them to believe in permanence. But without writing, without monumental stone, without stable climate, their endurance would be precarious. 300,000 years is long enough for many attempts. Perhaps the true answer to how many civilizations came before us is not a number, but a pattern of convergence and dispersal, of gathering and scattering, of memory held tightly for generations and then released into myth. The silence of prehistory does not confirm hidden golden ages, nor does it confirm absolute simplicity. It confirms only that time is vast and preservation selective. Somewhere in that vastness, human beings stood together under unfamiliar skies, organized their lives with meaning, and built what seemed stable in their present. Whether we would recognize those efforts as civilizations depends on definitions shaped by our own era. The corridor stretches backward beyond sight. It may contain fewer grand ruins than imagination hopes. It may contain more forgotten thresholds than textbooks allow. What it certainly contains is repetition, of adaptation, of cooperation, of resilience tested and retested. And as we consider our own moment in that long continuum, it becomes difficult to insist that we are the singular culmination. We may be one chapter in a much longer, quieter story. A story in which civilizations are not counted easily, but felt as brief concentrations of human intention against the patient, reshaping surface of the earth. At a certain depth of reflection, the question begins to change shape. It is no longer simply about counting civilizations that may have existed before ours. It becomes a meditation on thresholds, on how often humanity may have approached complexity, touched it, and then slipped back into dispersion before permanence could take hold. If one imagines the timeline of Homo sapiens as a long, dimly lit corridor, then the last few thousand years glow brightly at the far end. Cities rise, empires form, scripts harden speech into record. But most of that corridor remains in shadow. Not because nothing occurred there, but because the light we use to see depends on durable materials. Writing casts a powerful beam backward. Before it, illumination fades. And yet, the capacity that gave rise to writing did not appear suddenly. The neural architecture necessary for symbolic language, planning, abstraction, all of that predates script by tens of thousands of years. Humans were thinking, organizing, remembering, and imagining long before clay tablets existed. This cognitive continuity complicates the notion that civilization is a single breakthrough event. Perhaps civilization is less an invention than a condensation, a moment when multiple streams converge. Population density, environmental stability, surplus resources, symbolic cohesion. When those streams align, complexity crystallizes. If they misalign, complexity diffuses. During glacial maxima, vast areas of the planet were inhospitable. Ice sheets locked away water, deserts expanded, habitable zones contracted. Human groups likely clustered in refugia, pockets of relative stability. Within these refugia, population density could increase. Social networks might intensify. Knowledge might accumulate. When climates shifted again, those clusters would disperse. This pattern may have repeated multiple times during the Pleistocene. Each interglacial period offered a window. Each glacial advance closed it. The archaeological evidence for such cycles remains fragmentary, but the climatic oscillations themselves are well documented in ice cores and sediment records. Human adaptability across these cycles is equally well established. What remains uncertain is how often adaptability translated into structured, semi-permanent social systems. One must resist the temptation to project modern categories backward without caution. Civilization, as defined today, includes bureaucracy, institutional memory, and formalized governance. Earlier societies may have embodied complexity without formal institutions recognizable to us. Yet complexity need not be bureaucratic to be real. Anthropologists studying non-state societies have documented intricate systems of reciprocity, ritual authority, and seasonal leadership. These systems can endure for centuries without written law. They rely on shared belief and social memory rather than codified statute. If such systems expanded regionally during favourable periods, they might resemble early civilizations in function, even if not in monumentality. The difficulty lies in detection. Without durable architecture, without metal tools or ceramic abundance, without writing, recognition becomes subtle. Soil discoloration, post-hole patterns, distribution of artifacts. These are faint signals compared to stone pyramids or ziggurats. And time blurs even those signals. There is also the psychological resistance to extending complexity too far into the past. To do so challenges the narrative of linear ascent. It suggests that humanity may have stood near thresholds before, only to retreat. It reframes progress as contingent rather than inevitable. This reframing carries implications for the present. If civilization is contingent on stability, then its survival is equally contingent. The Holocene provided a rare climatic calm. Whether that calm persists indefinitely is uncertain. The geological record shows that Earth's climate can shift dramatically over relatively short spans. Our own era has begun altering atmospheric chemistry in measurable ways. Unlike hypothetical Paleolithic societies, modern civilization leaves unmistakable geological signatures, plastics embedded in sediment, radionuclides from nuclear testing, carbon spikes from fossil fuel combustion. These markers will endure. They testify to scale. Earlier civilizations, if they existed, did not leave such signatures. Their scale, if any, was smaller, their environmental footprint lighter, their disappearance quieter. This contrast invites a subtle reflection. Perhaps the measure of advancement is not magnitude but resilience. A civilization integrated closely with its environment might leave little trace after its dissolution. It might not scar geology in lasting ways. Its disappearance might resemble natural succession. Would such a civilization be considered less real because it did not engrave its existence into rock? The question returns to definitions. Some researchers have proposed that the story of humanity is one of repeated experiments in complexity, most of which failed to stabilize. The Holocene, under this view, represents an unusually long experiment that has thus far persisted. If so, then the number of civilizations before us may be impossible to quantify precisely. Some may have lasted centuries, others millennia. Many may have existed only as regional networks rather than unified states. Their memory may survive only as myth, as distorted accounts of floods or lost golden ages. Or perhaps there were fewer such attempts than imagination allows. Perhaps the constraints of climate and population density truly prevented sustained complexity before the last 12,000 years. The humility lies in admitting that we do not know. Archaeology continues to uncover surprises. Sites once dismissed are reinterpreted. Chronologies shift backward incrementally. Each discovery adjusts the map of human antiquity slightly. But even as the map expands, the corridor behind it remains vast. How many civilizations came before us? Perhaps the better question is how many times humanity gathered with enough cohesion to believe in its own permanence. Those gatherings may not have resembled Rome or Babylon. They may have been quieter, clusters of dwellings arranged around shared ritual spaces, networks of exchange linking distant groups, seasonal congregations governed by shared cosmology. And when those gatherings dissolved, the earth absorbed them without ceremony. The sea rose, the forest advanced, the wind carried sand across abandoned hearths. Time is patient. It does not discriminate between monumental and modest. Given enough years, both are reduced to sediment. The last 5,000 years glow because writing anchors them. But beyond that glow stretches a depth of lived experience that may never be fully illuminated. Somewhere in that depth, perhaps, were civilizations by another measure, fragile convergences of human intention that rose, stabilized briefly, and then yielded to forces beyond their control. Whether they were many or few, grand or subtle, may remain uncertain. What remains certain is that humanity's capacity for complexity did not begin with clay tablets. It began much earlier, in minds already capable of imagining permanence, and the earth, indifferent and enduring, has been quietly reshaping the evidence ever since. There is a point in this long reflection where the question no longer seeks a number, but a perspective. The inquiry into how many civilizations came before us begins to feel less like an archaeological problem and more like an exercise in humility. It reveals how narrow our illuminated window truly is. If the span of recorded civilization is a thin shoreline, then behind it stretches an ocean of unrecorded time. In that ocean, waves of human adaptation rose and fell. Some crested high enough to leave traces in stone, others dissolved before hardening into permanence. It is tempting to imagine that what we see in the archaeological record represents the only true emergence of complexity. But emergence itself may be cyclical, not in the dramatic sense of global resets every few millennia, but in quieter rhythms, regional flourishing followed by dispersal. The late Pleistocene was not a static backdrop. It was a theatre of rapid change. Ice sheets advanced and retreated. Vegetation belts shifted latitudinally. Animal populations migrated or vanished. Humans moved with them. In such a landscape, social organisation would have required flexibility. Perhaps that flexibility prevented early societies from ossifying into rigid hierarchies. Perhaps permanence was less valued than mobility. A civilization that prizes movement over monument leaves few ruins. There is also the matter of demographic scale. Before agriculture, human population density was low compared to later eras. Even if structured communities formed, their total numbers may not have reached levels necessary for large-scale architecture. Without surplus grain or livestock, construction projects would remain limited in scope. Yet small scale does not imply lack of sophistication. Archaeological evidence from sites like Çatalhöyük suggests that dense settlements emerged gradually and without obvious centralized authority. Houses were built tightly together, entered from the roof, adorned with symbolic art. There is little evidence of palaces or monumental temples. Authority may have been distributed rather than concentrated. If such distributed complexity characterized earlier societies as well, it may not have produced singular structures recognizable as capitals. The definition of civilization, then, becomes less about grandeur and more about pattern, repeated habitation, shared symbolic systems, coordinated labour. These elements could arise in various configurations, but endurance requires continuity. Continuity depends on environmental stability, demographic resilience, and cultural transmission. If any of these falter, complexity can unravel quickly. Genetic studies indicate that human populations experience bottlenecks, periods of reduced numbers. Such bottlenecks can erase cultural memory as effectively as physical destruction. Knowledge not transmitted is knowledge lost. Even within the span of written history, libraries have burned, scripts have fallen out of use, entire languages have vanished. Without written records, oral traditions can fade within a few generations under pressure. In deep time, such fading would leave little more than ambiguous artifacts. One must also consider tectonic and geological processes beyond erosion. Earthquakes can bury settlements beneath landslides. River avulsion can relocate channels suddenly, abandoning old cities. Volcanic ash can preserve or obliterate depending on circumstance. The preservation of Pompeii was accidental. Countless other settlements likely met similar fates without preservation. The question persists: how many such settlements existed in eras before writing, whose destruction left no narrative? It is possible that the number is small, that environmental constraints truly limited early human organization to small bands until the Holocene stabilized conditions. It is equally possible that regional complexity emerged repeatedly, each time approaching but not fully achieving durable urbanism. The absence of clear evidence for pre-Holocene cities suggests that if such complexity existed, it did not reach the scale of later civilizations. But scale is not the only measure of significance. Consider the possibility that early societies prioritized sustainability over expansion, that they adapted to ecological limits without pursuing monumental permanence. Such societies might endure for centuries without dramatically altering landscapes. From the perspective of geology, they would be almost invisible. Modern civilization, by contrast, leaves unmistakable marks: atmospheric carbon shifts, synthetic compounds, altered sediment layers. Our imprint will persist in the stratigraphic record for millions of years. Earlier societies, if they were lighter in impact, would blend back into Earth's processes. There is a paradox here. The more environmentally integrated a civilization, the less likely it is to leave enduring geological evidence. Perhaps the question of how many civilizations came before us cannot be separated from how we define civilization itself. If we equate civilization with dominance and monumentality, then the number may be few. If we equate it with organized social life sustained across generations, then the number may be greater. But numbers may be less important than pattern. Human beings have always sought belonging, structure, and meaning. These impulses do not wait for writing. They arise wherever language and shared imagination exist. Somewhere in the deep corridor of time, small societies may have believed they were building something lasting. They may have told stories of origins and futures. They may have organized their landscapes carefully, aligned their gatherings with stars, cultivated plants in ways that suited their climate. And then climate shifted. The sea rose, the river moved, the forest advanced, and what they built dissolved without ceremony. The Earth does not archive intention faithfully. It records in layers of sediment and chemical signatures, indifferent to human hope. Yet the absence of visible ruin does not negate the presence of lived experience. How many civilizations came before us? Perhaps fewer than legend suggests, perhaps more than strict definition allows. The truest answer may be that civilization is not a singular event, but a recurring tendency, a pattern emerging wherever conditions allow, fading where they do not. In that sense, the corridor of prehistory may hold many beginnings and many endings, each as real to those who lived them as our present is to us. The glow of our era feels permanent from within it, but from the vantage of deep time, It is only one more concentration of human intention against the vast, reshaping surface of the earth. And somewhere far ahead, our own traces may join the others, layered quietly beneath sediment, awaiting a question that has not yet been asked.